Oh, here you go. Sorry. Okay, let's double check your settings. So like,
Yeah.
check it at the bottom. Make sure we got the right.
And it should be. They're building the report as we speak.
Okay.
So I could be fine.
Okay, good.
Yeah.
Yeah, this is a weird. Speakers to C USB. No, it should be like. Should be this 2C media, which means maybe some.
Wait a second.
Sorry, again, let's sneak in here. Like, did this get unplugged underneath, maybe?
It's on the pink little thing.
Got power, on pink. Try that again.
There was.
Might have to-
That's the one I last time. It's not doing anything. This one again.
It's gotta be that C thing, because that's what this is called.
Yeah, I don't know.
And it's almost like it's not showing up. You might have to. Will you want to tell you to just pull that back for so I can see the cable?
Sure.
Go ahead.
Bait.
Is that moving?
Yes, yes.
You know what?
It's working. Yeah, but it's this microphone one that's working.
Yeah, but that's the problem, is that doesn't work fully. Remember,
Yeah.
that'll work if you aren't using Zoom, but it won't capture Zoom, the Zoom set.
Mm.
Somebody unplugging your stuff again?
There it is.
People like to play with all the plugs in this room.
They move things around.
Don't do it. Yeah, let it be.
The other room, we spent, I think I spent 3.5 hours, but almost everything was like all kinds of other way.
I see how you are. I know where you live, man.
How do you know that?
Nothing more.
It smells good. I have access to pay records,
Okay.
so it's almost gone.
What's that?
I have access to pay records.
Yeah.
That falls under my department.
That shouldn't be too big of an expenditure.
Well, not a big expenditure, just means
You just have an address,
Check
yeah, all you need is an
USB-C.
address. Actually,
So.
you need to close that one tray button here.
Do we
in your
specifically
bedroom.
need to see how we have all these
I
ones?
drove by your house last night.
How about
Did you?
here on this one?
No,
So my bedroom's on the backside. You can't-
Eggs are too
but
expensive
it
though.
does have to be that one. When I reboot the computer.
This one, right?
Well, it's
saw
gotta
that
be
on
the
video,
USB-C
somebody's house got
specifically,
eggs, and I
unless
thought,
I'm
"Wow, they're-
changed. You might have to reboot your computer.
It's fancy.
You gotta commit, yeah. The whole computer.
Uh,
It's not even showing up.
Remember when toilet thing- What's that?
Well, since it does it.
Yeah.
That or mix large.
The toilet paper is so expensive, I don't know what they were doing back in those days. Oh, I mean, not expensive, but rare, I guess.
1 year, my little league team won the championship, and they came over to
Literally.
my house.
Yeah, hopefully we can get it
And I
that
told
fast.
them, they're like, "So
It
what's
is
the
supposed to be in
thing?"
the pink one, right?
As soon as you come over and clean my house. They got the whole thing back over.
But I read a little bit before I hear that.
Yeah, you had leverage, man.
My dad rolled up a bunch of- I think we may have made it.
Yeah, I'm gonna have to. They get on this.
Most of that's done in,
I get it. You gotta get it before rain for sure.
oh,
Yeah. Then.
we have it, whatever it is.
Oh,
all
no.
good.
Yes.
We're recording now.
Thank you. Okay, thanks for coming, everybody. So my name is Mike Wigger, Mayor of Cottonwood Heights. This is the Cottonwood Heights City Council work session for Tuesday, October 18th, 2022. Thank you, Matt. We're gonna start off our meeting today with a review of our business meeting agenda. So we'll begin with the Pledge of Allegiance tonight. We actually have a acknowledgement, which is the introduction of a new Cottonwood Heights police officer. We have Assistant Chief Paul Bredeman here with us today, as Chief Russo's traveling or on away on business. So Chief, anything you want to add to that?
No, looking forward to it. Robbie loves to do these things. I haven't been able to do this in years, so I'm excited to do it. So good new employee. So
Yeah.
looking forward to it.
Excited. Yep. I love doing the stuff like this. So what we then have our city council committee reports. And then we'll do 3 minutes apiece for each of those tonight. And then we'll have a citizen comment period. Then we will move to a public comment specific to the Mid-Valley Active Transportation Plan. And Mike, why don't I have you give a little bit background?
Yeah, I gave the work session overview of that last time. I'll plan to do a couple minute introduction of that before the public comment opens in the business meeting. It'll be the same presentation.
Okay, perfect.
Well,
Any questions on that?
well, I can certainly make a public comment. There are a number of walk paths to the schools out there, especially east of Butler Elementary, that I think probably should really get integrated. I mean, this is all really bike oriented, but for walking and stuff like that, I think those ought to be called out as well.
Sure.
And we ought to be able to determine which of those may be bike accessible as well.
Okay.
But I know that we have them at Anzac, they have them by Canyon View, they've got them by Butler Elementary. Anyway, any of those other. Tim has a list too, because we paid to have them maintained.
They're part of the interlocal with the parks district or recreation district.
There's one right above Doug's house.
Thanks, Scott. So next on the agenda this evening is a public hearing, which is for our proposed budget amendment for fiscal year 2022-23. We'll talk about this in a staff report in just a second. We'll have a Scott address us on that. And then we have two standing quarterly reports that will come from. The first will be our financial report from our Finance and Administrative Services Director, Scott Jurgis, and then our United Fire report from our Assistant Chief, Riley Pilgrim. So we're looking forward to both of those reports in our business meeting. We have two legislative items on the agenda for this evening. First will be consideration of resolution 2022-53, approving entry into a consulting agreement for the Big Cottonwood Canyon Mobile Action Plan. And Shane, is there anything you want to add to what this entails?
No, this is as the mayor said, a mobility action plan for Big Cottonwood Canyon. There are various entities, Alta Town in particular, also the CWC. They're getting kind of concerned about trying to get ahead of anticipated additional traffic in Big Cottonwood Canyon, since most of the focus lately has been on Little Cottonwood Canyon. And so they've hired a consultant that seems to be quite capable to do this study. The total price is $155,000. Alta Town is paying about $100,000 of that. I think the CWC is paying 10 or 15. Cottonwood Heights is proposed to pay about 10 or so, and then the resorts are kicking in about the same amount as well. So
Kind of bright as well.
oh, sorry, yes, not Alta, Town of Brighton.
Okay, that makes a lot more sense.
Yeah, sorry about that.
Yeah.
Yeah, edit everything I've said, references to town of Alta, town of Brighton. Hard to keep those ski resort towns straight, sorry.
Yeah.
Anyway, that's what this is, and the agreement has already been approved by the Central Wasatch Commission Board, by the town of Brighton, and I think probably that's as far as it's gone. Perhaps the resorts it's on, I don't know for sure.
And you probably remember through our budget process, we incorporated the funding. So it's the 15,000 was set aside for this purpose as well. So
one of the things that I think is important why we've done this is it gives us a seat at the table with more weight than if we weren't participating. And so, I think we want to say in what happens. And so this helps us.
Important with what's going on up Little Cottonwood.
Absolutely. Absolutely. Thank you. And so then next on our list tonight will be consideration of resolution 2022-54, accepting a bid and approving entry into a construction contract for reconstruction of portions of the Big Cottonwood Canyon Trail. Matt, I'll let you talk about.
Yeah, real quick, Mayor, we discussed this last council meeting. This is part of a grant we received from the county, the track grant. Right, did I get that right? The track grant of about $84,000. We went out to bid. This sections of trail go from I-215 to our pond, the detention pond, or the debris basin pond there by the shop. It's for various sections in there to rebuild and resurface. So this is what's on there, and we're asking for an agreement for that contract.
We found out that we couldn't expand the bid to keep going east. We actually will have to go out to RFP.
We'll need to rebid that portion of the trail if we want to move forward.
and we did have staff has gone out and evaluated the rest of the trail, has some cost estimates, but what we'll do is we'll bring that probably to you as part of the retreat discussion at that point on whether we want to pursue the rest of it at that time. So.
And then we will approve our consent calendar. And then that will be the business meeting. So next, we have the opportunity to learn more today about form-based code. So we've invited the principal landscape architect from Voda Landscape Design, Mark Morris, to come and educate the council on this topic. So if you want, we'll invite you up to the table. And
And Mayor, can I just quick preface, Voda is contracted with us through our general plan project. They will come in once the draft is farther along to actually help us develop a type of form-based code for certain areas in the city. So they'll be working with us. They'll be back as we move forward the general plan process.
great. Well, welcome, Mark.
Great. Thank you for the time today. As you mentioned, my name is Mark Morris. I am principal at Voda. We do a lot of urban design, a lot of planning work. We work with a lot of communities up and down the Wasatch Front. We're located in downtown Salt Lake, so we know up into Davis County and throughout Salt Lake County. We've done form-based code work with several cities. I would say form-based code at the outset is really getting comfortable with a new way of doing things. As the name implies, form-based code is really more about the form of the development as opposed to the use. So we've got a few slides we'll go through. We'll get through as much of this as we can in the time allotted. You are not expected to remember all of this. Really just wanted to give you a brief overview about form-based code, why cities like form-based codes once they get comfortable with them, what sort of benefit it is to you as a city, to private property owners, and why it's a different way of doing things that more and more cities are getting into.
And there will be a test, Doug, so.
Multiple choice.
Ungraded quiz, we'll call it. So the form-based code really, as I mentioned, is focused on the aesthetic and the form of a development. So we're talking about architectural details, heights of buildings, footprints of buildings, things that are much easier to navigate as a city than with land use based zoning, which is what most cities focus on. That's not to say that use is not part of the conversation, but it's very much secondary to the form of the development. One of the things that's great about a form-based code is it's really tailored to the specific conditions of a community, of a neighborhood. It's not one that it's a copy paste from one place to the next. It's not even that if you have a form-based code in Cottonwood Heights, every neighborhood that applies to is exactly the same. And so as we get into form-based code, what we do is we identify different districts and we say, okay, what's going on along Fort Union is going to be different than what's going on at the mouth of the canyon, what's going on in different parts of the city. So really it gives an opportunity to make decisions in advance about what we want that development to look like. And as long as the developer or property owner meets those requirements, it hopefully is a more streamlined process.
Can we interject questions as we go along? I've been studying form-based code. I have a lot of questions.
Great.
You know,
The book you've got in front of you, I have it as well.
yeah, it's a great book. So what we need, as you know, Cottonwood Heights is very gentrified. So while we do have brand new build out still in front of us.
Yeah.
We're experiencing a lot of neighborhoods feeling uncomfortable with the way that parts of their neighborhood might suddenly need to be changed. An example is what's going on in our Dover Hills, a neighborhood just on the west side of Wasatch Boulevard, where an LDS ward house and the surrounding acreage, suddenly the LDS church decided to put it on the market. And the surrounding owners were very concerned about what that was going to do within their neighborhood. So what excites me about form-based code is that it can be, why is it doing now? Somebody turned something on.
Couple microphones on.
So existing neighborhoods, we also have existing older neighborhoods along the south side of Fort Union Boulevard who have been very concerned about how lots are being changed out. Sure. So I hope you'll address that tonight too, how form-based code could be used in gentrifying areas by a group of residents, maybe it's a quarter mile by 2 miles the other way, to say, this is what we want to see over the next whatever 20 or 50 years in the way that as things rebuilds. Can it apply to rebuilds then?
Oh, absolutely. Absolutely. Form-based code really can apply to any neighborhood. In my experience, the neighborhoods that you see change are those that are perhaps like a commercial corridor, like Fort Union, where you've got new, you've got old, and really saying, what do we want this to look like? As Mike mentioned, this really, generally a form-based code update is attached to a general plan process where the community's been through a process to say, what are our goals? What do we want? How do we make the policies of the city, the code, the ordinances line up with that? Generally, if you'll go to the next slide, Mike.
So one thing I'm going to ask of the council, Matt, or Mark, sorry.
Yeah.
So if you have a question from something specific to the slide, I think that's okay, but I want you to get through your.
Oh, yeah. And I think we'll answer.
So if you see something that he's presenting that you have a question on, I'm okay, if you're okay stopping and talking about that.
Yeah.
Okay.
Absolutely. So generally, one of the questions that always comes up, how does form-based code benefit current or future property owners? One of the things that it does is a form-based code is intended to make it more flexible as far as what is permitted, as long as it meets those forms. So as I mentioned, it's less focused on the specific use of what's going on and really on what is the form of it look like. So these images here at the bottom, these are two different developments on the same piece of land. Both of those would meet the requirements of the form-based code. The one on the left is a little more commercial. It might be office or stacked apartments. The one on the right is, some townhomes. So there's some flexibility there to say, okay, well, leave it to the property owner to decide what the market is telling them is a good use for that piece of property. The city really says, as long as you know, stay within these height restrictions and the form, all of that. Again, that process is intended to be more streamlined. Inevitably, there are properties that would become what it's considered in normal planning terms non-conforming. That's very normal. That basically in a form-based code, you would have triggers that unless that property changes drastically, they wouldn't have to come into compliance with the form-based code. That last number there may be to answer your question. How is a form-based code created? Really, it's a collaborative process that when it comes out of a general plan process where you engage the community to say, what do you really want? It's one thing to say we want a walkable community. It's another thing to like figure out, well, what does that really look like? Generally in a general plan process, there are specific nodes in a city that communities identify as, you know, we could have this, you know, there could be some change here. We could have more of a town center type of place. In communities like Cottonwood Heights, there's always some opportunities for redevelopment, for new development. There's lots of ways to structure a form-based code that it can apply, whether it's brand new development or a property turning over. So that process is intended to really codify what are the community's goals in a more specific way than just, well, this is commercial, we'll hope for the best. So that's maybe to answer your question briefly there.
So one statement in that number 3 says,
Yeah.
so it'll create a cohesive neighborhood by allowing people, property owners to greater flexibility. I'm trying, so how does that, so you're allowing property owners to do more. So how does that create a more cohesive neighborhood?
Well, again, it's kind of making those decisions in advance to say, okay, in this particular node, a 3-story building is going to get us what we want. As long as your building is 3 stories and it fronts the road in a specific way, whether it's commercial, whether it's apartments, whether it's townhomes, it's really saying, what is the look of the place that we're after? In talking with Mike and your planning staff, there are always some projects that when they actually get built, there's always some kind of pushback of like, oh, that wasn't what we were expecting. The intent is to think about that in advance and say, okay, well, you decide the overall use of this project as long as you meet these requirements. Again, trying to make.
Could an example of that also be, we just came from a conference where they were showing like what appeared from the curb side would look in the front, you know, again, from the curb, similar to the houses, which are likely going to be single family houses on that street.
Sure.
However, if we're trying to get more affordable housing in Cottonwood Heights, it may be that you know, 1/3 of an acre actually behind that facade has 3 front doors. So you actually have 3 smaller attainable housing units. But the look from the curb would please these existing neighbors because it has the feeling of the neighborhood versus some apartment complex or is that an example of how it could be used that a neighborhood would agree that we're amenable to?
I think that's a great example to really say, okay, the form meets the kind of existing conditions in the neighborhood. The density is a little bit higher, but the actual implementation, it feels more cohesive with what's going on in the neighborhood.
Sean, did you have a question?
No, that was going to say, that I saw that same example. It's from the Daybreak area. And it was a very good example of being able to integrate something like this into our community where we have just these pockets of property that to be developed.
Yeah, and I think the pockets of property is a really key piece there because it's not saying we're updating the land use code for the entire city. It's saying, okay, during the general plan process, it was expressed that there are certain areas of the city where a change or an improvement is appropriate. How do we make sure that the code expresses that? The built environment really is just an expression of the code that we apply to it. And so it's focusing, how do we get that to line up a little bit more, more directly?
Well, yeah, I would just, we had a lot of a discussion that informs us a little bit back when we were doing our original ADU discussion. There was a lot of opposition to that entire concept. How dare you all of a sudden add extra families, a single family, and that makes it a duplex. So if we're dealing with just the outsides, I guess that's what I was just telling Tim, that may be a good question to put on our survey to find out where the, you know, what our citizens.
Sure.
When you're saying that, I'm thinking of what, 3 or 4 doors down. It's an R2, it's across the street from an R1, but the building envelope's the same. The concern was that it was a duplex rather than a single family home, even though they could be identical
Yeah.
from the outside.
Yeah, and I'm not saying that there will not be opposition to this idea. But in my experience, cities generally, they will say, okay, let's apply a form-based code to this particular node. When we've gotten comfortable with it and we kind of see how it works, then we can expand and say, okay, let's apply it to other parts.
So when you say no, you're just talking area.
Just an area, yeah, to say, okay, well, let's start with the kind of the gravel pit area, let's focus on that. When you feel comfortable with how that code operates, you can apply it to other places. So generally, I'd say single family neighborhoods are rarely impacted by form-based codes. Generally, they're not really worth spending the time to talk through because for the most part, they're built out and the changes are pretty minimal. Really, it's the major corridors, major nodes that are going to see more of that change.
Mark, how long has the form-based code been used?
Oh, across the country, it's probably been at least 20 years. In Utah, the oldest codes are probably about 14 years old. I think the first code I ever worked on was in Farmington in 2008. So theirs was very different because it was around a new front runner station. And so it was just open fields. And so the code is a lot more greenfield development based than redevelopment based. The good thing is that we can look to other cities around the state and kind of see how have they kind of tailored them since they've implemented them and kind of learn from others.
That was my question, is tailoring it to us, you know, individual properties and where it is, because we've had some issues where what we've got, I know there's the PDD is another, I guess, tool that we've used before, but there's been developments that didn't turn out the way I would have liked to see them. And I don't know if this can help mitigate some of the problems that we see in that.
That's the hope, is that it would mitigate kind of the surprise when the development goes up and it's not quite what was expected. It's again, there's some trade-offs because as a city, you're kind of letting go of the control of use a little bit, which may make you uncomfortable at the outset, but really having more control on design and saying, okay, when it comes to frontage, how does this development front the street? How does it, what sort of public space is there? What is the aesthetic of it? So there's some trade-offs to be negotiated, but it is 100% tailored to, okay, what does this particular node in Cottonwood Heights need as far as driving towards that hope for outcome.
Let me just clarify what you said. The things that came out not the way we expected were not PDDs, they were just a standard zonings.
Yes. Yes, I wasn't referring to that, but I'm saying that some people didn't like PDDs, but what I've seen when they're used correctly, you get a lot more and you don't get surprises. And I
So,
think
you could definitely incorporate this into that process.
There are big elements of it in our PDD ordinance. There are a lot of form-based elements mixed in there. It's not full.
So it's a
form-based
hybrid
code,
kind of
but it's
a-
close, yeah.
okay.
Great. If you want to go to the next slide, and Mike, if you tell me when we've got 5 minutes left, we'll make sure we're keeping on.
I'll give you a signal.
Okay. So typical zoning, this conventional zoning here on the top, we're very familiar with. Form-based code, this number 2 really focuses on that physical form. So this image here on the bottom right was a code we wrote a few years ago for Midvale city. The Midvale's historic Main Street really is kind of primed for infill development. But if you've been to historic Midvale, though that street, really, it's all about the form of what's going on there. There's historic buildings that the community really wanted to make sure were preserved, while also opening the door for more development to bring more energy to that area. So there are places, again, where you have redevelopment areas that you may want to say, okay, what can we do to develop a vision for this place. And there may be some of those that are a little bit more greenfield development where you're planning road networks and those types of things.
Did you say height is something you regulate within form-based?
It is.
Okay.
It is. Mike, if you go to the next. So again, the codified community goals, really, all of this is based in, okay, going through that process, what are the priorities of the community? How do we make sure that that is part of what goes into those requirements for the form-based code? Most form-based codes will have a public aspect and a private aspect. When I say public aspects, that's for a place like the gravel pit where you're planning out roads, public spaces, parks, things like that. Where you have redevelopment, more of that falls into the private aspect. So the majority of that would be private development. How is someone changing their property and what sort of, how does that meet the goals of the community? So not every part of the form-based code would have like a road profile like you might in the gravel pit where you're going to need lots of those kind of public investments. Mike, if you go to the next one. And again, the coordination of physical form, coordinating between those public and private aspects of development. Going through a general plan process, there may be roads that are going to change profiles, investments that are going to happen. How do we make sure that that investment is justified? If we're concentrating development in specific areas, how do we make sure that that's tailored to that public investment? So there benefits, again, there's lots of ways to kind of show property owners how going down this path is going to benefit them with some flexibility, but also having them agree to added design guidelines, as it were, from a form-based code. Mike, go to the next one, please. Most form-based codes have a few parameters. No two form-based codes are the same, so these are pretty general categories. As we get into this process, these may adjust, or there may be additional pieces. The four that we've got here, form district is really saying, what is the character of this neighborhood? A single family neighborhood is a very different form than a city center. And so saying, okay, what type of district are we talking about? Frontage type, really the way buildings front public street do a lot to influence what the character of that neighborhood is. The building type, so as we get into more detail on form-based codes, there's specific building types that kind of say, hey, here is the menu of types you can choose from. It's up to you as a private property owner to choose one, as long as it falls within one of these that we feel is appropriate for that area. Go for it. And then the fourth one is use. So use, like I said, is more loosely interpreted with a form-based code. Obviously, if we say, okay, the maximum building size in this form or in this district is 5,000 square feet, you're not going to get Walmart coming along and saying, we want to build 100,000 square feet super center, because the use really can be controlled via the types of buildings that are permitted.
Do you ever get into shared spaces? Like a lot of our residents have voiced interest in more kind of family-owned businesses and such. And we know that the cost to run a small business can, if they can share some of the amenities or even restrooms. And we've all been to buildings where, several small businesses, okay, the restroom is down the hall and to the right and it's shared by.
Sure.
So can that be then built into form-based code to?
I think if it's something that you feel the community would support or there's demand for it, again, you can tailor it to what the community feels like is in demand out there. Which is the nice thing of the form-based code, is that we can really tailor it to the specific things in a community. A lot of form-based codes that I've worked with deal with shared parking and trying to navigate that, how to figure out, hey, here is a huge investment required by the city to have this much parking. Is there a way to have a shared parking agreement to be more efficient with the use of that space? That one's very tricky, to say the least, but the sharing of assets and resources, I think, is a good approach to a lot of these questions. The geographic parameters, again, the code is very specific to geographic areas, and so it's context-based. It's again, not a citywide code update. You're not changing every neighborhood in the city. It's really concentrating on those areas where we want to see change. Mike. We'll send all of this to you and you can read through it, but there's more parameters. It's not just opening the barn doors and saying go for it. There's parameters that are really, I'd say absolutely required, and there's some that are kind of nice to have, so you can build in incentives to say, this isn't required, but here's an incentive to do some additional things. The intent is to make the process as straightforward and as easy as possible, to make it easy for a developer to do the right thing as far as development and kind of helping support that vision for the community. The approval process is intended that if they work through the form-based code and they meet those requirements, that it's something that's approved at a staff level, that the staff can say, okay, here are ways in which you're not compliant. We need to adjust those in order to have this expedited process. If there are exceptions or other types of approvals that are outside of that, it can always go through that kind of hearing in front of the planning commission, those sort of conditional types of approvals. But the intent is to keep most of it in that over-the-counter approval process, that a lot of those decisions have been made in advance. Some cities that I've worked with develop a design review committee where it's third parties, it's not city staff, it's not council or planning commission. And that review committee really is, local designers, people in the community who can interpret the code. And if there is an exception or someone is asking for a special case, you've got someone who can come in and give some advice to the staff and say, yes, this should be approved, or no, that's not the right approval. I'm on a review committee for Farmington City, and I'll tell you 90% of our battles are about where the front door is located. It seems like that it just is a constant struggle to kind of have a unified frontage, even in commercial areas. Fighting over the front door location seems, at least in their community, seems to be a thing that occurs a lot.
Is it that the developer wants it in a different place than the design review committee?
Yes, every time. So, and sometimes we win and sometimes we lose, and that's fine.
Can I just comment?
Yeah.
So one of the things, and I've worked with some of this as well, the key really is those design standards.
Yeah.
And that's where the elected officials, as well as staff, as you're defining the policy, those design standards are the key. Because then they drive what the look and feel is going to be of that facility, building area. And those design standards are really key, especially when you're dealing with developers that come in and want something different. You've already defined in the design standards what you want it to be and what it will look like. And it sometimes has to get quite specific on things. And so that's something that as policymakers that you really define upfront when you adopt a form-based code.
Yeah, and I'd say that more and more developers who operate on the Wasatch Front have worked with the form-based code before, and so I think they're getting more familiar with that level of scrutiny, and I kind of see the benefit to say, okay, we're going to get more scrutiny on design. It's up to us to determine what is the market telling us what the demand is for what use is going to happen in this place. But there's a learning curve for sure, but I think you'll see, I've never seen a city adopt a form-based code and then decide they're going to get rid of it. Usually it's okay, we've had it for a couple of years, let's expand that code and apply it to a few more places.
One of the key things that we're getting from residents is that they want to protect their views. And so especially in a place like Cottonwood Heights, and so as we think about these redevelopment areas, coming up with ways to talk about setback and the way things could, a bit like a pyramid, come away in the places that again help to protect not only resident views, but that the buildings are oriented as such that they capture the best views. And I mean, I think this whole architectural style and form could have a lot of appeal as we look at things were.
Yeah, I think again, not every city has the incredible views that you've got here, and so I think something very specific to Cottonwood Heights form-based code could be well, views are really key. How do we make sure we've got those step backs so that we're protecting those views? And really, the reason why a lot of people are here is for just this proximity. So got just a couple more slides. I know we're probably running short on time. Let's maybe skip through a couple of these, Mike. Let me maybe just to wrap up at the end of this, I've got a couple example. Yeah. So Bountiful form-based code was adopted a few years ago. It was pretty similar to Midvale, where they had a historic main street and they wanted to make sure that new development was context sensitive. And so you'll see in a form-based code, there's lots of diagrams like this where there's height, kind of a height range of what a development should be, where the entrances are, types of setbacks, those sorts of things. Not something that you usually see in a land use ordinance, but again, opening up the door a little bit to say, it's up to you to decide, is this building an office building? Is this building residential? As long as it meets these requirements, that meets the goals for the code. The next page, again, just kind of an example of, I'll go back just one, an example of some of the standards in that Bountiful code. Building articulation, how much articulation do you see in that architecture? What types of public amenities are part of that development? Colors and materials can be a little tricky. You don't want any one person's opinion on, okay, well, this is the color that I like, so I want it to be everywhere. But having some kind of discussion as to quality of materials, durability of materials, to again, kind of express what it is that you want the character of that place to be. And then the last one there, structural height. The heights of buildings, again, define a place very specifically. With Bountiful's Main Street, there's a historic height that most of the buildings, height range that most of the buildings were in. So making sure that any new development was contextual to that. And then this last one, I mentioned the Midvale Main Street form-based code. You can see this area here that was defined. The different colors there are those different form districts. And so the red down the center, that's kind of historic Midvale Main Street. That's where they have lots of old historic buildings. That was a very specific form district. And so anything that came along needed to match that. The other colors, again, open up to different types of forms and development that wouldn't necessarily be appropriate on Main Street, but for the neighborhood would be the right direction. Let's see, and then I think there might be one last slide. Maybe that's it. Okay. As I mentioned, there is a huge amount of information out there. Just wanted to give you a brief summary of this and sort of why it was worth talking about. I'll have Mike send this out to everyone, and then next time that we talk about this, we can get into a little bit more information. But we've already had several conversations with staff as far as what parts of the city might be open to where that might be appropriate. And so that really is the first conversation is, okay, where do we want to apply this? Where do we want to start that process?
Right. Well, so we've got about 5 minutes, I think, which would be okay. So if we have some quick questions from the council, I've got a couple. And anybody have some before me? Go ahead, Doug. You have one?
I guess it sounds to me like this is kind of no surprises kind of a situation. Is that, to sum it up in a very short?
Yeah.
No surprises,
that's the hope.
planning. Are there things that we should try to avoid that have been used in the past that have kind of not worked out that we should be? I'm sure Mike knows some of those, and Mark, you probably know some of those, so that we know that we use this in an appropriate way.
Yeah, I think one of the tricky parts of the form-based code is that we don't get too hung up on, we'll call it the park cityfication of the city. You go to Park City and everything is architecturally identical. Like everyone has the same stone, they've got the same wood. What we're not trying to do is, this isn't architectural standards, that this is the architectural style of Cottonwood Heights. That can be tricky for some people because they want to enact that type of regulation. Really, the form is the focus, not so much architectural style. And so we may say, we want materials to be durable materials like brick, stone, wood, that type of thing, but we're not gonna say the stone has to be, you know,
Right.
the stone to match City Hall's stone. So there's some design discussion, but it's not so much that it's, okay, architecturally, this is exactly the style of the entire city will be. So there's some flexibility there, which is tricky for some
Thank you.
to accept.
John,
Yeah, I like the idea of the flexibility and the aesthetics to fit into these pockets within the community. Because I think that's part of the big pushback is people's perceptions of what is available may not be opened up as wide as it should be. Going to our convention, was it last week or the week before? I lose track of time.
Yeah.
We got a chance to see a lot of these examples and it was really eye opening. And I think that being able to share as we become well versed in this, being able to share that with the residents, I think will go a long way to create some understanding. And I look forward to learning even more about this and how it's being received in the places where those changes have taken place. And what kind of feedback those communities are getting from the residents after the completion.
are there any state statutes that form-based code has to adhere to? Anything state level wide?
No, I mean, as long as you're clearing the bar of, you know, land use, you know, those types of things that are required. There's nothing that really triggers that.
Okay, sorry, I interrupted.
There are some recent state statutes related to how far a city can go with regulating some types of kind of architectural things, but nothing that I would say is gonna hamstring the city. Is what you're trying to do.
Did developers like having a project in form-based code or? Yes, I mean, I imagine probably yes, right?
Yeah, I think it's the same type. If it's a developer that's never worked with the form-based code, I think it's the same type of kind of educational process. Salt Lake City enacted a form-based code along 400 South. It's probably been at least 12 or 15 years. And they've adjusted that code a few times based on feedback from developers, which is a nice option that the city can go in and say, okay, we can adjust as we go along and we get specific feedback to what's going on in the community. I know Clearfield, they have a form-based code that they required a certain percentage of open space. And they found that the developers, it was really the percentage they were requiring was almost a deal breaker for a lot of the types of development the city wanted. They adjusted that. If you haven't been in Clearfield recently, Clearfield is, I mean, to say that it's a massive change is an understatement. Their main road through Clearfield, there's all kinds of development and things that are happening under that form-based code. So it's adjustable. So it's not to say like once it's set in stone, you can never change it. If you get feedback from property owners, you can always make modifications to it.
You should say what.
Ellen and
stone
then
they
Scott
use.
will do question.
Can you give an example of, does anything come to mind where form-based code was used within a given city to incentivize affordable housing? We know that there's, parking and various things that a developer looks at in terms of their return on investment. Do you have any example where form-based code was used to steer developers into, along transit and, any examples?
Yeah, I think that corridor of 4th South in Salt Lake is one that's really interesting because it's had a form-based code for as long as it has. Attached to this conversation when it comes to affordable housing is parking requirements. I don't know if you've had a parking requirement conversation with your planning staff, but a lot of cities are adjusting parking requirements for affordable housing projects merely because that adds so much cost for each project that if we decouple that from city code and say, okay, well, let's say here's a maximum that you can do, but leave it up to that particular.
And then it's based on a certain amount of units per square footage and, I mean, you could tie it in that way so that you get more housing units within a,
Sure.
and
Yeah, I mean, if you're a developer and instead of building 250 parking stalls, you can build 150, like that is a pretty significant incentive to reduce costs in the end, and you can, rent those affordable units.
and as far as deed restrictions and things like that, can that be listed in?
Sure. Yeah, and I think every city on the Wasatch Front is in the middle of the affordable housing conversation. I think with form-based code, it gives you a good opportunity to steer that new housing where you want it, where it's most appropriate. And I think context really is part of that conversation, that there are a lot of neighborhoods that will see very little change, and some neighborhoods where there might be quite a bit where it's appropriate and where the infrastructure would warrant.
Right, Scott, anything from you?
Well, yeah, I mean, when I think there's definitely some interest there. And we've done some things like that with our plan district development zone. The kind of cautionary tale comes up, because when I first started Googling this, Sarasota came up, where it's been just lawsuit after lawsuit after lawsuit after lawsuit. Obviously a poor implementation, it was probably a little too wide. So what is going on now that prevents that from occurring here, where you're just bogging things down? The other issue with Sarasota, they says it seemed like every 4 years we got completely new design standards. It depends on who the mayor was and the council, because they go in and just completely change it. And so,
Yeah, well, I think it's obviously our laws in Utah are very different than the laws in Florida might be. The code itself, the intent is not that it gets changed frequently. It's really saying, okay, the form-based code is going to say, here are the things that are deal breakers you absolutely have to meet. It's less, we'll say capital D design standards. It's less about design standards and more about, okay, how does the form match the kind of community goals? The intent is to make it easier for the developer to build in such a way that it meets those goals, and less about a, kind of a battle over the details in there. So,
well, I think that was part of the issues. It didn't end up
it's clear.
being
It's clear.
as easy.
Yeah. Yeah.
And so it ended up being in lawsuits rather than.
Yeah, and I think the code for Salt Lake City's district along the tracks line and Fourth South, I think they have like it's a score system where a development they get points for certain things, and as long as they get enough points, they can proceed. So there are a lot of different ways to structure it to make it more, I guess, more user friendly.
Where is the public input in the process?
With this process, that I think the fact that you're as far into the update with the general plan as you are helps a lot to say, okay, how do we line up the goals that have been expressed to that the form-based code update, and then having opportunities for the public to provide input or feedback. So you could do
The general plan of the zoning part, because once it's past that, then there's no chance really for the public to come in and say,
sure,
I
yeah,
don't like.
yeah. Well, and there's always gonna be things that people don't like. But to say,
Sometimes legitimately so.
yeah, and I think to say, okay, during the general plan process, here were the things that were expressed. Here is how the code is meant to, help that come to be. There are a lot of different ways to kind of gather that feedback. A lot of times when you start talking about code, people just lose all interest. When you start showing renderings of like actual buildings, then people kind of perk up and say, oh, is that what's going to get built? And then you have a different conversation.
My guess was the vast majority of the public is not aware of that. That's one place where I think the PDD would probably be advantageous, is because then on a specific project with specific. I mean, if you put those guardrails in place, then there is a cost. Okay, this is what we're proposing, and it calls for the public comment at that point.
Good point. Well, Mark, thank you. We really appreciate it. It was very informative, and I think something that's deserved our attention to learn more about. And so thank you for engaging with us and appreciate your presentation. Thank you.
Yeah,
We're really,
Appreciate the time.
yeah, thank you.
Thank you, Mark.
Thank you.
So under staff reports, we have some updates to our sensitive lands evaluation development standards or SLEDs. And I'll have our community and economic director, Mike Johnson, go over those with us.
Thank you, Mayor. This is, we gave you an update on this a few months ago while this process was still with the planning commission, but we have a recommendation now from the planning commission. So we're essentially starting the full discussion on the SLEDs ordinance with the council now, given that you have a recommendation from the planning commission. So going into this presentation is very long tonight. I am in no way going to get through it all. We'll just go as far as we get within the time we have, and then plan to just keep this on agendas until we get through it and have the discussion that the council wants. So I mean, you can see here, these are all the slides I have. I did kind of an executive summary style update of all the different provisions in the SLEDs ordinance that are changing. So we'll just work through a handful tonight and just keep pushing away at it in the next couple of council meetings. But to start with some background and timeline, this is a technical update to the existing SLEDs ordinance, and I'll clarify again. SLED stands for Sensitive Lands Evaluation and Development Standards. So it's an ordinance whose purpose is mainly to guide and regulate new development activity in various sensitive areas of the city. So it's going to apply most directly and most strictly to new development activities that are happening. And you'll see in a minute, there are a lot of different types of hazards that are regulated all by the same ordinance. Some are related to each other, some are vastly different, but it's all housed in this one ordinance. So it's very technical and very engineering heavy and has required input from a lot of experts to get to where it is right now. You can see here, these are the types of hazards that are regulated. So surface fault rupture, slope stability and landslide, liquefaction, debris flow, and alluvial fan kind of run out from debris washout. Rockfall hazards, groundwater source protection, and high groundwater in low-lying areas. And then riparian corridor and watershed. And I do want to just put a caveat. This is listed as a hazard in the current ordinance, but no regulations exist today. So we took that as, hey, the ordinance intended to regulate this. The place it referenced for additional regulations didn't exist, so we've added those. So that's the riparian standards are probably the newest and most comprehensive changes made. And that probably will merit its own work session discussion at some point that can go into detail, because I know there's been a lot of community interest around that one. The technical staff review and update began back in 2019. Again, the primary purpose of this was to update all of the sensitive lands hazards and requirements to the highest and best practice for identifying, studying, and mitigating hazards in the city. Again, especially during new development or redevelopment activities. We've consulted with a number of outside agencies and experts throughout this process. City staff obviously was heavily involved, contracted with Geostrata, who's our contract geologist and geotechnical consultant. But we've met and had discussions with FEMA, the Army Corps of Engineers, the Forest Service, UGS, the Utah Geologic Survey, fault experts who have actually directly written a lot of the literature that we're using and that people throughout the state use as kind of the gold standard for how to do these studies. We've talked with them. Salt Lake County Flood Control, and then various environmental protection experts at the university. There are probably more that I'm forgetting there, but formal discussion and public hearings began with the Planning Commission in January of this year and continued through August. So 8 months worth of discussion and public comment. Throughout that time, we got a lot of feedback and direction from both the Planning Commission and from the public comments at those meetings. We'd get feedback or direction or questions, we'd go research them, and then we'd bring back an updated draft. And the history of all those drafts is published on the city website as well. The Planning Commission voted in August to recommend approval to the council. The vote was 4-3. And then numerous updates have been made, again, throughout the process and even after, based on planning commission feedback and based on public input.
I know we're not the Supreme Court, but do we get any opinions based on those that vote against?
Were they unified in what they hated, or was it
No.
like 3 different things?
Two of the commissioners, it was their first meeting, so I think that might have had something to do with it. And I don't know. They didn't all provide a
state
reason
it.
for why not.
I know some of them mentioned they did not like, they thought it was overreaching. Even though they were new, they were familiar with it, but there was reason rather than just be there.
In terms of public noticing, we have done a substantial amount of that. We've done our formal posting requirements that posted online and sent out to people who subscribe to the city's email notification channel. Ordinances, drafts, and staff reports and minutes are all available, published on the city website. We've made a point to get those up and keep those on there throughout. And then we've published multiple city newsletter articles informing residents citywide of these changes. There have been a few changes made since the Planning Commission recommendation. These are based on internal discussion and clarifying things that we don't feel changes the nature of the commission's recommendation, which is the case with the SLID's review procedure. We had modified that previously of the actual DRC process that applicants go through to get a land disturbance or site investigation permit. We ended up changing that back to the way it is in today's current ordinance because it actually we think is comprehensive and works well. And then based on Planning Commission recommendations, and this may be what Councilmember Peterson was referring to and some of the concerns with the riparian protection standards, we've added clarifying language to the riparian protection section, enabling regulatory agencies like county flood control or various utilities that have easements along water channels. We've clarified that they are allowed to do their maintenance and improvement work. Emergency flood control work is allowed. We don't want to get in the way of that. That's not the intent of the ordinance. And then we've also added stronger clarifying language to ensure that existing properties that exist today, are not being redeveloped, can continue using their property for the most part in the way they are, reasonable maintenance activities and use of their property as it is, and they can continue doing that. And then clarifying on some of them how those activities should be done.
Does the distance from the waterway change dependent upon?
It does, and we can get into that. That, like I said, that'll be like a good, probably its own work session worth of discussion, but yes. So I'm just going to plan to just go through this and stop me if you have questions. Like I said, this was put together by a lot of experts and consolidated. So if I can answer a question, I will. If I can't, I'll find the answer and get back to you all. But what I've highlighted here is things that are new or changed, and not everything, but the substantial. This is kind of the executive summary I was talking about of all of the changes that have been made. So we'll just start at the beginning of the ordinance and work through until we're out of time. The purpose of the ordinance has largely been left as it was. All of the purpose statements that are there today have remained there. We've added a few on top of that. The overarching purpose that has sub kind of objectives is summarized there, that development is regulated in a manner that reasonably preserves natural scenic beauty and ecological integrity. And then there's 15 sub goals based off of that purpose statement. We've added new provisions, which are listed here. Promotion of health, safety, and welfare, wise land use, protection of city infrastructure and financial health, and minimize adverse effects of geologic hazards to public health, safety, and welfare. And then in this purpose statement, we've added the various types of hazards that are regulated by the ordinance, which goes through your, fault hazards and steep slopes and groundwater and all of those things.
Yeah.
Restart your computer.
In the scope and application section, this section's been removed, but all of the language that was in it has just been moved or reallocated, and in some cases deleted. So details about applications for sensitive lands activity, other technical stuff, supplemental and conflicting provisions, requirements for hazard studies, they've all been moved to places where we think it makes more sense to have them. There's a line in today's ordinance that gives my position, kind of a discretionary ability to declare that a proposed development area doesn't qualify as sensitive lands, even if it's in sensitive lands areas. We don't think it's good practice to have discretionary regulatory standards in the code. So that has been removed. You'll see as we go through this, all authority in to approve or initiate sensitive land studies comes from the DRC, the Development Review Committee. And that's been a big push in this, is to make sure all the authority is routed through the same channel. And then descriptions of what's in all of the appendices of the ordinance, which is where the detail is located on all of the individual hazards. That's been removed. It was kind of redundant to have it there. Each appendix is still part of the ordinance. There's just not a, a summary section up above. Some new definitions have been added. These are available. I'm not going to go through the actual definition of all of these, but these are all available in the draft ordinance. It's a lot of technical stuff, a lot of things that were maybe included in the ordinance by reference before, but not properly defined, that have come up as questions, throughout the years of using this ordinance. Some notable updates to existing definitions. Anywhere it refers to city or staff or any personnel at the city, we've clarified for purposes of this chapter, and unless otherwise specified, all decisions, approvals, and recommendations by the city shall be made by the DRC. So there was some inconsistent language before of who does what and what does the city mean, and why does it say city in some places and DRC in the others. This is an intention to just make sure everything routes through the DRC.
For clarity, the DRC is currently made up of.
Yeah, so there's a definition. It's made up of staff from community and economic development, city engineer and public works, the building department, fire department. It can be others as needed, health department, outside experts. And then we have also added in here that the DRC membership be approved by city council by resolution once each calendar year.
We haven't done that in the past.
There's a current resolution that was done in 2020, 2019 that establishes the makeup of the DRC, and it doesn't do it by name, it does it by position, by staff position. But that's just once a year to come back and say, okay, council, here's the makeup of the DRC, adopt a resolution.
I'm a little bit worried about that one, for fear that it slips through the cracks, and then we have people arguing that the DRC that acted wasn't properly constituted because we forgot to do the resolution. So maybe mark that one.
Sure.
For something.
So just to clarify, the DRC would make a final decision, not the city council.
On administrative, yeah, say a fault study is required for a development. How you do the fault study and what reports to submit and whether the reports meet the code. That's all done administratively from the DRC, not by any one person, but from the DRC as a body.
If you'd like to do that, we'll put you on the DRC.
It's similar to, in a lot of ways, a building permit process.
It's
where
the
they're required to
riparian
meet
thing
all
that
the-
I'm mainly concerned about
Yeah.
myself.
Yeah.
But I know we want professionals in each.
But I mean,
one of those, but-
If we just put the DRC membership approved by the council on the first meeting of every year in January, is that what you're concerned about, Shane?
Well,
skip that
like
process?
Mike said, the one we have now just states what positions hold are on the DRC. And so if I understand the proposal, it's naming names to actually be on the DRC for a particular year. I guess I don't see the need for that as long as we have whoever is in that particular position that's already designated.
Well,
Covered by a resolution. And I worry that if we did this, if we forget to do that, the first meeting of every year, by then subsequent decisions by the DRC could potentially be attacked by folks claiming that the DRC wasn't properly constituted because the city council didn't do the resolution.
because the DRC is a very important part within the check and balance and the procedures and the process for sleds, I support the mayor's view that we should be able to get in a groove on this and make sure that we understand who's on that DRC each year on a timely basis. And I would like to keep that element within
This
SLID.
bullet point, Mike, isn't changing, we're not naming individuals, right? We are just have the ability to add or delete
Yeah, well,
positions that are current inside that membership.
if we were to do this, we would come and recommend, it's position titles or, staff from these departments that are part of the DRC. Because if you name specific names and someone leaves, then you gotta come
Right,
back.
that's exactly what I was saying.
But they're in the definition of DRC, it's not here. It does say who the staff positions that typically represent the committee.
I think the more we can document these things, it's going to protect the city financially for potential
Yeah,
problems,
but
lawsuits.
Shane's, that's not Shane's concern. His concern is if for whatever reason there is any kind of a hiccup or a mistake, then you open yourselves to an enormous amount of liability. And so, is there a way to possibly reword that to where we review it or something like that, rather than calling for a formal approval in a meeting? Or set that as a administrative policy?
Permissive may be reviewed annually or something. But to me, if you say these positions are members of the DRC, unless amended by the action of the city council, why that assures that we don't open ourselves up to that sort of.
I like the idea of reviewing it. That's not the issue. I do see the significant opening to liability.
Well,
in the event of a
I
mistake
just
is
want
made.
to, well, and perhaps what I'm trying to emphasize is that I think record keeping is very important. I think that when the DRC meets, it should be denoted on whether it's formally, it doesn't need to be a formal meetings, but minutes, but I think that there should be a trail that we can easily get our hands on and see as a council and as a city. What steps have been taken, what has been agreed to, on what date, by what, which of these titled entities were at any given meeting, what the agenda was, and what was either confirmed or action steps made. I would like there to be a trail that we can see that will help to document this important process.
Yeah,
Well,
thank you. Yeah, we can
So that's up to the council.
continue to discuss. Yeah, thanks.
We've modified the definition of development to make sure roads are included as defined development. We've seen, because there's some language in here where if you're in a natural steep slope area, no development's allowed. But roads weren't exclusively or explicitly referenced as counting for development. So we'd get pushback of, well, let us build the road on this steep slope. And we didn't feel that was the intent of the ordinance. So we've clarified that now. Utilities, though, are not included as development. And then we've updated definitions, more technical, to engineering geologist, geotechnical engineer, and then structures designed for human occupancy to make sure those definitions are up to date and clear, and the required qualifications for engineers that we will accept work from is more clear. In the applicability section of the ordinance, there's some language in here that was previously in that scope and application section that we've removed and replaced here. Basically, the notable thing that's here is clarification that the sensitive lands requirements apply to all lands located in Cottonwood Heights, not necessarily just in the overlay map areas, if they contain or potentially contain one of these regulated hazards. So if there's a property just outside the little overlay map, but it clearly has steep slope issues or a fault line or something, we can still apply this ordinance to those areas. And then we've added clarification on building code risk category buildings. This is a little bit technical, but basically this clarifies that certain buildings are more sensitive in terms of their hazard to human life in the event of failure, such as schools, hospitals, emergency, fire and police stations, and then buildings that have a really high occupancy. And those buildings later on are regulated a little differently, requiring greater setbacks from faults and more extensive mitigation and things like that. So kind of a technical thing, but also important. And then we get into some of the different development standards and controls, and these apply regardless of what specific hazard may be on a site. And these are just clarifications or updates. These are all in the ordinance today. This is what's on the screen here is just how it's been updated. So in slopes, we've clarified that no grading, retaining walls, or structures are allowed on steep natural slopes. There is an exception for slope areas under 2 acres. There's a typo there. It's my fault. That are not connected to a larger natural slope area and are not natural slopes east of Wasatch Boulevard. So the Planning Commission spent a lot of time talking about this. So any natural slope east of Wasatch is just in the ordinance is not allowed to be developed or disturbed by development in any way. West of Wasatch, we have seen cases where you have self-contained, mounds for lack of a better word for it, that are they're not connected to a larger natural hillside anywhere, but they've been, big mounds on properties for a number of years. The way the current ordinance reads is if it's over 30%, you can't touch it. But getting rid of a mound like that doesn't necessarily impact, health or safety or any slope stability issues. If it's just going away and it's not part of a natural hillside. Another example of this would be some of the streets even behind City Hall here, where you have numerous lots that are all part of one slope area. It could be interpreted that the way the ordinance is written today is a little overly strict, that, being able to maintain or modify some of those types of properties wouldn't be allowed. So basically, there's a small exception here for smaller slope areas that aren't part of a big natural hillside, that are not east of Wasatch Boulevard. That through the DRC, if they do all their appropriate studies, they could be allowed to be modified or developed.
Like, I was thinking a couple more minutes, maybe 5:15. Does that
Sure.
work?
Yeah, that's great.
Perfect.
Single family lots, we've clarified, in sensitive areas, there's restrictions on how much buildable area a lot can have to even be eligible for development. If it's in a sensitive land zone, it's 3,500 square feet. We've clarified that you can't count area outside of the minimum setback as buildable area, because the setbacks of the city wouldn't allow you to build within that anyway. So the buildable area has to meet setbacks basically. Then some standards on maximum impervious surface. Basically, there are limits on the amount of impervious surface. So that's hard surface that water can't drain through. Can be developed in sensitive lands areas. There are certain hazards though, where reducing water infiltration into the ground can actually help mitigate the hazards. If you have a fully saturated high groundwater area and there's a lot of runoff, that might actually make the hazard worse. So through study, we've allowed some a mechanism to look at that a little closer. And I'll just go through these next 2 pages here, because then I think we're on to the next section. We'll stop there. Clarification to earthwork. This is really technical stuff, but basically we've updated requirements for earthwork and digging and soil samples and things like that to follow the specific publication, which is the commonly accepted professional standard for soil compaction studies. Vegetation and revegetation, we've added a more explicit requirement that landscaping plans have to be submitted with details on the types of plants and the location of them and the number of them and how they're going to be irrigated. It just helps us know that areas are being vegetated or revegetated properly. And then streets and ways, we've removed maximum impervious surface requirement for streets. And then added requirement for developments to provide vehicular and pedestrian connectivity.
And what was the rationale behind removing maximum impervious surface requirements?
I can get more detail. I believe it's that we've seen roadways built that are pervious roads, and to have the city take care of those is not, I don't think, in the wheelhouse of road maintenance. And you can handle through the private side of the development, you can handle the runoff created by roadways outside of making the roadways themselves impervious, which has maintenance issues and upkeep and things like that. But I'll find
all road asphalt is always impervious. I'm not following.
like paver roadways where you can actually there's a private development, Newberry Grove off of Creek Road. Their whole driveway is like brick pavers and it's permeable. But I'll get a detailed answer on that one for you. And then the last one for tonight, we've added additional clarification. There's an architectural design section, and previously it said anything in the sensitive lands area that requires design review has to go to ARC and Planning Commission. There's no real reason to have the Planning Commission look at something that's purely architectural or design related if we have the ARC doing that in a public meeting already. So we've just clarified that it doesn't have to go to ARC and Planning Commission. It's only design. And then subdivision plats, when an area is developed and they have to record a subdivision plat, we're requiring they have to notify or a note on the plat that the whole thing is within the city's sensitive lands area. So it's a good disclosure thing for potential buyers in sensitive developments. So I'll stop there. I have a whole presentation. We'll just pick up at the next work session.
Mike, you're awesome. You're a land use nerd, but you're awesome.
Well.
So I see a lot of heavy eyes, so I think that was a good place to stop.
Yeah, so
I appreciate your expertise, so thank you very, very much. And so next on our staff report is we're gonna talk about focus surveys. We in our retreat talked about we actually put into our budget 2 focus type surveys that are scientific through Y2 Analytics. And so I'm going to turn the time over to Tim, our city manager, and we'll let you kind of lead us off on how we want to address what we want to do.
Yeah, so we've had conversations over the past few months about different potential questions that could be included into a focus survey. We were hoping to have some draft surveys for you to look at, but we've kind of decided to take a step back, and there were also some unanticipated issues working with Y2 Analytics the last couple of weeks. And so what we want to do is really define the topics. Kyrene, in a recent conversation we had with her, said that if you are going to go to focus survey, instead of going a lot of different directions with a limited number of questions, that you really focused into topics, and those topics is what you go into the survey. And we're looking at 2 surveys right now. The council can go with more than that, but what I would like to do is really have a conversation on what those topics and the types of questions that you want to see in those topics. So for example, here's some ideas. One, we've talked a lot about land use planning. We're in the general plan process. This is something we've discussed previously, but really understanding some of the land use questions, especially related to the Fort Union corridor, the hillside development area as well, along with transit elements associated with those. That could be a topic. So land use development along Fort Union and hillside. That's one example of a topic that you could really focus and drill down on questions to get certain things related to that. The second topic would be housing. We did get some housing information in the previous survey that we had done recently this year, but really drilling down and understanding what people want related to housing. I mean, we hear a lot that people have concerns with density, which is understandable, but there's also that issue of, we hear people wanting their children to move back to the community, and there needs to be some type of housing component to address that as well. So you could really drill down and ask some pretty specific questions on housing. Those are a couple of ideas that we could work towards, but we really wanted to have a council discussion and get a little bit more direction. And then I can get with Kyrene, have her start drafting questions, and then get them back to council for input. So that's my intro.
When we're talking about, you're talking 10 to 12 questions of survey, correct?
Roughly, you can give and take a little bit, but not, these are not huge surveys. One of the reasons for that is you don't want to get fatigued with these individuals, not just on these surveys, but having multiple surveys that are being thrown out at them from the city.
So the one I put on there's transportation and traffic issues or I kind of saw those 2 that you proposed as the same, but maybe that's just me.
So I think it'd be really helpful if we could come up with one tonight that we all agree on. And so there might be things that come up in terms that make us want to focus on something different. But my suggestion is that as a council together, we determine what we think is the most important topic to move forward with our next survey.
Can I make a suggestion?
Yes.
A response, growth is one of the key factors that we found in our other Y2K studies. And how we do that, and a lot of that has to do with density is a big one. Obviously, we're dealing with commercial with Hillside. They're dealing with parks, parks with Dover. We're dealing with, there's many things, but I think growth right now is number one on most people's minds right now, and responsible growth. But that's just my 2/5.
Well, and under responsible growth, of course, falls, in my opinion, land use and housing. I mean, that's what's
Yeah,
driving,
buried together, right?
which the thing I like about, kind of that broad umbrella that you just suggested, is that we can, give some definitions. I think that's been a suggestion. I know that Councilman, Bracken has put forward, and I agree, and I know we're just trying to figure out the topic, but as I think about, there's there's probably 3 different things that I'm really interested in, but I think I could support the idea of growth if we were able to both address some specific land use and housing. What do you want to see for our city, since we are in the general plan update process? It would be nice to find out if our residents are either even aware of things like the gateway overlay. I think there's that. I mean, so I think that topic we could really get some real meaty feedback. Although mobility and transportation is my middle name, so I like the idea of that. But perhaps if we're doing 2 topical surveys, I could let that take the back seat to go for.
They're all interconnected.
They
too.
are interconnected.
That's part of it, is how do you divide them up into, if you're just going 2 topics.
That's what I was gonna say. If we're gonna do this, we have to get even more narrower on our focus. And if we go with the growth issue, I'd like to see it go to housing and that concern. Because that's where we get a lot of the pushback in the community as to how that's going to occur, how it's gonna be done in a way that's not gonna disrupt everybody else. But then there's also those growth concerns coming as intersections when they do want their families to live here. But the reality is if we don't do something on this housing thing, somebody else is gonna do it for us. And we have to keep that in the back of our mind as to what may be coming down the pipe statewide for these issues that we have to address here in housing. There's a lot of focus in that area that we have to be concerned with.
Well, and to Councilman Newell's point, I just would add that one of the sessions I was in at the ULCT conference, probably the most contentious and packed breakout room that I went to, was on the subject of developers and this sort of thing. And a lot of people were complaining that they said, well, what is the number? What number are you looking for from each city? Because I think maybe Mike Johnson could answer this, or our city manager. In the last 3 years we've added, is it 37 affordable housing units? So is the state looking for Cottonwood Heights to produce 50 a year, 100 a year, suddenly produce 1,000? I mean, there's a lot of questions I have as a council member on what is satisfactory to the state to begin with, to understand, but also what is palatable to our residents.
And we have to look at also the terminology that's being used. What is affordable housing? What is moderate income housing? What is density compared to, what is expected from our community? And that's how we dive into details when we start to ask those types of questions.
Yeah, to your point, it's really dense if it's a duplex,
Exactly.
and we're like, oh boy, that's,
That's where I
it's-
like to attach some
Yeah.
values.
Yeah.
And a number, that's because it says, you want nothing but single family housing in Cottonwood Heights? Okay, fine, but you need to balance that against your kids are gonna live in Harriman. Or
So I'll give you,
something like
I'll
that.
give you an
But-
interesting statistic,
But
Scott.
yeah, the moderate housing,
So
what is that number
Exactly.
that people would need to know?
I asked our staff to tell me how many apartments exist currently, how many units, how many apartment complexes, how many townhomes. 1/3 of our housing is multifamily housing.
By unit.
Nobody would guess that Cottonwood Heights is currently 1/3 multifamily housing.
And Mayor, that's not counting what we have on,
That's not
Books.
counting anything that's not,
yeah, the
Currently
gravel
built.
pit. We're talking about also the Walsh property, right? Is that one already?
that's not even counted.
That's not in it.
Nothing that is not built is not
Yeah.
counted. So I mean, if you
So
want to
you're
tell,
talking
if you want to tell
units.
Cottonwood Heights that we're not doing our share. That's not
No,
how
no,
Cottonwood
we-
Heights is.
And we've
Yeah.
always hit our, I'll say the wrong one, moderate or affordable, whatever
Moderate
it is.
income housing plan.
Yeah.
Plan, because we have a couple of a few very large apartment complexes.
And that's
that we
Pinnacle
usually-
too.
It's Pinnacle, it's Santa Fe.
Multiple.
So yeah,
Well,
we've got that.
Are we not doing our share already is the question.
But
I think the
Again, if
perception
you
is that we're
quantify
not,
that-
that we're just single family
you
community, where in reality, we're much more than that.
but yeah, there's a way to phrase that information into a question that says, yeah, is that enough?
What, if
Or
not,
you-
what's
or-
enough?
Or what would you like to see?
So let's narrow it down. So I think we're right. I think we're getting
That
really
close.
close. So in my mind, I've heard land use with growth and density and development is, we don't want to go too broad, because if we go too broad, we're not going to get, like you said, narrow questions, or we're going to get out of what we're trying to accomplish with a focus type survey. So
That's what I said, singular word, housing. And then you're looking at what is the cost, what is affordable housing?
see, I have
It's-
housing as a completely separate issue of land use.
Yeah, that's what I say, just as a singular topic
Yeah,
for us.
I think housing is its own.
Yeah, it's its own.
So we might have to do 3 or 4 of these. You know, we have budgeted 2, but we can always do an amendment and add a couple.
Yeah. But I'm thinking.
I heard the mayor likes to write checks.
But I think it's
Joke about that.
I think it's important to touch on what's causing the most angst out here now in our community. And for, other cities are included in this. What is causing the most angst? It's the unsheltered. That people are trying to address housing for unsheltered. It's our housing, affordable housing. It's our moderate income housing issues. Because the state, our inventory is starting to level out, but the inventory that's being produced is multifamily, and that reality needs to be expressed so that our citizens don't think that we're doing something singular, that we're not doing anything different than anybody else if we have some of these units come in, to our community. But we want to find out the way to do it in the right way. We want to make sure that we're not just tossing multifamily housing at people, but doing it the right way. So we are built out as a community, and we have to be very careful in the way that we produce anything to address this issue.
With the amount of moderate income housing that we have, the apartment complexes, I think that is good information, and that maybe that's in a prelude, giving a little bit of information before you ask the question. Because according to what our median income is, this is what you would be allowed to pay for rent. Is that where we actually have a lot of those? You think that's too high? Do we need to focus a little more down? But if there was a 12th question still available on this thing that relates to that housing would be that density really equates to transit.
I was waiting for the T word
And
there.
it may, like I said, that may be outside this scope. That depends on how many questions we get to, but that's something I think people really, if you want more transit, you need to be able to provide, users need to have it, and they need, or the willingness to pay for it.
I think TOD, transit oriented development, definitely would be part of these housing questions, because that is just integral to a plan to do any higher density. It should really be associated with transit, and I think any way that
Well,
that
you're just not gonna get the bus routes or anything else unless you've got people that will use it. Or you're just gonna subsidize it.
well, and I even am interested in, and I don't know if we're gonna get down this granular related to housing, but the whole conceptual thing that there are people out there who for affordable living, they need more affordable mobility, housing, childcare. I mean, you know, these are real people, these are workers. We need working class people in Cottonwood Heights. And we could work on how to frame that exactly, but I would hope that would be part of this.
But framing it is important.
Yeah,
Because
So
without
certainly in
leading.
some
'cause I-
places
you said that.
seem to legislate their way out of working class people, you know.
Well, I'm not saying, you know, maybe
no,
that's not
I'm just-
politically correct,
no,
but you know what I'm
No,
getting
no,
at.
yeah, I agree,
The resources that are available to people like
Yeah,
childcare.
because you'll get in
Within certain
resort towns, you know, that's quite common where, well, I go to work here, but I have to live.
Well, that's why Heber is growing exponentially, because the workers are moving to Heber.
Yeah.
And Cottonwood Heights is Cottonwood Heights. Where do you live if you work here?
So I think we've got a consensus with housing. We'll start with housing. I wonder if one thing that the council could do is maybe create some questions that maybe you could submit to Tim. So did you hear that? So let's start with housing. Something that you think would be relevant and what you're trying to get from our community in respect to how they feel about housing. So let's as a council, let's submit 2, 3, 4 questions to Tim. And then we'll create some and then we'll come back and modify them and.
Aaron, I'm glad you brought up that, a third for multifamily housing. Because I don't know if the state of Utah realizes that.
I don't think
about
anybody
Cottonwood Heights.
realizes that.
Well, but yeah, that's something to let people know. It's like I say, we probably should let everybody know.
Not
You can
only-
build your house to 35 feet.
Not only that, we have some of those units that are subsidized.
Yeah.
So
No, yeah.
subsidized, yep.
Yeah, I'm gonna,
Maybe.
will you share that information? Because that's one of my write-ups for.
I can actually
Yeah,
send
Tim's the one who
I'll
gave it
give
to me,
the-
so yep,
Yeah.
we
send
have
it out to everybody.
Mike,
That's a good one.
Mike
I think
Johnson and his staff put that together.
As a matter,
I'm right.
Right.
That's ready for the next one. Yeah.
I'm looking at across the table.
Mhm.
What's that? What did you say?
I did actually really like when, maybe you could write up these things and put them on a shared Word doc on the OneDrive. So that as we go in, you can reply to comments, you can add comments,
Oh,
strike things out. It would really be nice to be able to see each of us go in and say, I like this, I don't like this. Or Doug, I think you need to rewrite that thing because it makes no sense. I don't know, whatever it is.
I like that idea.
This is on the other side of the table.
Yeah, I was gonna say.
Just that was,
No, that's a good
it was
suggestion.
good to see Ellen's comment. I could reply directly to them and then I knew. Because sometimes when you're doing the sharing the file back and forth, like Tim replied at the same
suggestion.
time I did.
And especially like if,
And then it got disappeared.
Yeah. And if we go into that singular document and we see that, you know, Sean Newell has already said my idea of a question, you know, then I'm not gonna take a lot of time building that, because it's already in the document that I can put in the column what he said, you know, I mean,
Ditto.
maybe, you know, ditto. So I really like that idea of doing this in a running documents.
Okay, I agree.
Yep.
Thank you. Great comments, good
practice
thoughts.
it.
We'll move forward.
Really good at it.
So next item is our proposed budget adjustment for our fiscal 2022-23 year, and we're gonna have our administrative and fiscal services director, Scott Church. That's 30.
All right. Okay, so this document was sent out with
Specific.
the council meeting packet, and so. Just to go through here, so I've kind of organized it by fund and then started to organize it by things that kind of are offset with revenue. And then other things that you need to take a little bit more attention to, if you will, because it's gonna be spend money out of our various funds and what have you. So starting out, number 1 is our marathon expenses and reimbursement. And so this is specifically the bus insurance. So we received money for that, and we have an increased expense for that of $8,700. Police marathon overtime and some various miscellaneous expenses adds up to, I need to check that. I might have a typo somewhere, because it can't be 22,222. I'll double check that between now and the next meeting. but I think it's the 21,415, but I'll double check that. 214. If it's different, I'll let you know. Police DUI shift overtime. Excuse me, these are overtime shifts based on an agreement that we have from the Department of Public Safety where they reimburse our overtime for that. It's two different groupings of reimbursements, $3,800 and $2,600, adding to that total. Police overtime for a contractor expense. I believe this was Cache Valley Electric, if I remember right. Where they reimbursed us $1,500 for some work that we needed to do for them. Police overtime for UDOT expense and reimbursement. This again is a UDOT thing that they needed us to be there for. Probably to block off some lanes of traffic for something, and $1,625 on that. Every once in a while, we get some restitution. This specific restitution is from a holiday court. Because they do our justice court stuff for an accident that was incurred, and this is reimburses that expense back into for us. Number 7 is a police CCJJ grant for training from the state of Utah. This is kind of an annual grant that typically comes in. It's for $3,000 and pays specifically for training for some of our officers. That's almost 90% of the time, 95% of the time it gets used for training. Number 8 is contribution from Cottonwood Heights Recreation Service Area for for low income youth to participate in a football league. And this is $3,725, and this would be an added expense. There's no revenue that comes in on this. This is an expense on us to them.
What was that?
I had CLG. What was that? Sorry.
What was that?
Certified local government grant.
Yes. I can't remember all the acronyms.
Yeah.
But for the historic committee, this is to to pay for the survey of historical homes from the state of Utah. It's $8,250. Number 10 is a rebudget of some things from last year. We had the door badge system project. Some of the things just were delayed for so long with things going. We finally got it going here again, and we'll probably spend the rest of this out. We spent about $84,000 last year, and this is the last little bit that we'll spend this year to finish that project, $45,000. And then number 11 is another thing that kind of carried forward, and 10 and 11 both really were utilizing the American Rescue Plan Act funds that came to the city. It's $200,000 for small business program grants. By the time we got everything rolling, we didn't really get the payout of that going until July of this year. Last I checked, just kind of FYI, we'd actually paid out $105,000, and there's continual payments going out as we speak.
Okay, so those are usually utilizing those funds. Why is it showing then as a just?
Yeah, that's what I was gonna ask.
We received the money last year, so the revenue came in last year, and so now we're utilizing fund balance in order to pay for those items, and so there's no additional revenue coming
So
in.
if it's not used during the budget year, we then do a budget amendment if
Yeah,
it
'cause
happens.
we
during
have
the next
to,
year. Okay.
the budget only lasts for the year that you're in, and it doesn't carry forward.
And you have to expend the funds or you carry them forward.
Okay.
Number 12, this is a transfer from the general fund to the capital projects fund for various property acquisition funding that could come up, so that money's available if we need to utilize it. Number 13, so UCA is the Utah Communications Authority. And they handle kind of all of the radio traffic that goes to their system and then comes back into the various, other radios and other things, whether it's the PSAP or whatever. They're upgrading to new things. We've been upgrading some of our radios, but it's an expensive endeavor. And so they're accelerating the time of when they're going to be changing over to a new system. And we need to be ready for that when that comes. And some of our radios, well, actually, a majority of our radios aren't ready for that. Yeah,
About a third
Yeah.
ready,
Yeah.
2/3 are not.
Yeah, and so this is to kind of get that going. This will be needed again next year, about this same amount of funding to continue this project and everything, but do you remember the timing of when it?
2024, is that right?
It's last quarter 2023, first quarter 2024. This has been coming for years. We started planning for it, but we're waylaid with some funding issues. They never set a hard date. They now have given us a hard date. So it's always been pushed off into the future, and statewide radio system has been upgraded. Our radios don't meet those specifications. Same with you up there, we're in the same boat we are.
Just said the
One of the
teachers
things,
now.
one of the things that I've asked that we do with this is to allocate some money now, and like you said, we might do it later. We probably won't go ahead and make the purchase yet, because the state hasn't, I think there's a possibility that the state will provide some grants, and I'd rather us not have purchased them at that point.
The state provided lots of funding for the state, none for counties.
Exactly.
First class,
counties
which
are
we
first class,
follow. Yeah.
Exactly.
It's us full more. So
So just in case, we'll have some money set aside, and then hope that the state will actually allocate some funds to us.
we're also hoping that we get a little better pricing from our current radio source provider, which is Motorola, which is tried and true and tested. They've got a sweetheart deal with a different provider that's not as good a quality. And we know that pricing is coming. We're close now, but we think it'll be better in the future.
So more to come on that. So number 14, we were able to sell the 2014 Ford F-150 that we declared surplus about a month ago. Got $25,000 out of that. Want to utilize those funds to purchase another, replacement vehicle for that.
She's a 10-year-old truck,
Yeah, kind of crazy, right?
Good residual.
an 8-year-old truck, sorry.
And it was snapped up quickly.
Oh, yeah.
Same age.
So,
I'm good to know.
moving into the capital projects fund. So again, these first couple of items are rebudgets of items that were budgeted last year that didn't finish. So there are a multitude of projects adding up to a net of $3,020,000. But a lot of them are roads projects, some of them are trail projects and other things. The big Cottonwood Trail maintenance is included in there. $3,765,000 of expense offset by $745,000 of revenue. And then number 2 is the Public Works Building. This is the remaining funds that were not spent last year. About $101,000 was spent last year on various things that we did, and the bulk of this will spend during the rest of the calendar year coming up here. Number 3 is a contribution from Cottonwood Heights Parks and Recreation Service Area, specifically for Ferguson Park, 17,400, and they had done something to gather some.
Donation
Benches and
donation for benches.
Yeah. So that's the net amount that they received.
Were we
from that.
expecting that?
They established a program where people could donate those types of things for the facility, and they administered that program, and then they're giving us the.
Great.
And I think everything was, they ran out of things they needed, if I remember right. I mean, between the bike racks, everything.
Really popular.
Yeah, that worked out really
great.
well.
It's definitely, a good way to make a nice finished product. So, yeah, for sure.
Something to keep in mind.
Item number 4 is a transportation investment funding active grant. And this is specifically for Fort Union bike lanes from the state of Utah, $399,872. Item number 5.
So I'm sorry, but what bike lanes are these? On Fort Union?
Yeah, so that's the gap between the new project on 1700 East and Brook Hill Drive to acquire and construct the grade separated wider sidewalk and asphalt bike lane.
By the
between those two
apartments?
Projects.
No, I'm sorry, where
East.
are we?
There's 2 new apartment projects on Fort Union. One's right across from Mount View and one is next to the fire station.
Right, and
We
so-
required them to build grade separated bike lanes and then wider sidewalks next to them.
But they don't
This-
touch each other.
There's 4 or 5 properties between them. So this money is to acquire and construct the same thing in between the 2 properties and connect them.
Okay, so the developers are paying for doing the bike lanes in front of their properties,
have
and
already,
and this
yeah.
is to connect the two. Okay,
Correct.
got it. Thank you. Got it.
Item number 5, this is the flip side of that, the $200,000 funds for acquiring property. This takes the revenue in here and then generates the expense so that we can expend that if anything comes available that we can utilize that. Item number 6, this is the additional funds to complete the Big Cottonwood Trail contract that was discussed earlier tonight. That will be on, the contract is on the business agenda later today. And so this would complete that funding that would be needed for that project. So again, let me just go back up here. So the net increase in funding demands out of the general fund is $499,000. As seen there. In the capital projects fund, it's $10,459,000. That sounds like a lot, but most of this is money that already exists in that fund in terms of projects that were not finished in the past fiscal years. Item number 1 under the stormwater fund is rebudgeting of unfinished stormwater project from the last year, $915,157. And that's just again, the projects that were not completed during the last fiscal year. A lot of capital type projects carry over at least 1, if not maybe 2 or 3 years, depending on timing of being able to get them complete and bid out and everything that goes with that.
Scott, I have a quick question on that.
Yeah.
With the funds that we're receiving through our, what did we call that, where we go through the, it's not a bond, but we're receiving through the utilities. What did we call that?
Stormwater utility fee. Well, there's a
Stormwater
utilities at
Right.
one.
Is that accumulating now?
Yes.
And then when will have we started using any of those funds yet?
Yes.
We are using them.
Yep.
Okay.
Yeah, we received a little more than $500,000 of it in our last fiscal year, started in January. So from January until June, the net receipts were a little more than 500,000. I can't remember the exact amount. And we're estimating an annual receipt of those funds will be about $1,400,000. So
We're still gonna put the 600,000 in that we've used previously.
200,000 is the guess from our general funds that will be contributed annually to that. There was an additional one-time transfer for the Keswick Road project. And I can't remember the other one other project.
Yeah. I don't know.
But I can't remember that they were about $1.2 million, I think, between both projects that was transferred in during last fiscal year.
The reason I ask is we've got some stormwater issues down on Siesta that we're trying to figure out where the storm drains there's 100 yards or more of that anyway, we'll talk more about it, but they're asking about that and the funds that come with that, so.
Yard shells and.
Yeah, make sales.
Yeah.
Scott, honestly. Something seems. When I see this, what it looks like is we're increasing our budget by $10 million, but that's not what's
No.
occurring.
Yeah, these are funds.
There's
that were-
something different with this report.
No,
than
these
what
are
you've done in the
funds that were
past.
transferred
I'm just like-
in last year that are being rebudgeted. So we transferred the money in during the past fiscal year into the capital improvements fund, because capital improvements fund really doesn't have a source of revenue unless it's a project that's in that fund that's doing something similar to like when we receive revenue here that comes in to help offset something. But these items are amounts that were transferred in the prior year. So normally we would see $3 million here that would be rebudgeted, but because we did the public works building, we have this 7.4 million that carries forward specific to that bond. You know, we got the $7.5 million bond for the public works building. And that's the remaining.
So why is that on a budget adjustment, I guess?
Because the expense budget cannot carry forward automatically. You have to rebudget it because we only budget for 1 year at a time. And so.
Is that by state? Code,
That's by state
you have to do
code,
that, yeah.
You could anticipate what you were going to
Even
do
if we.
early on when we're adopting the budget, but we won't know exactly what we spend out of the budget. We only thought we were gonna spend about $60,000 out of the budget when we were
Yeah.
creating the budget last year, and we ended up spending $101,000. So we'd have to come in and true that up at any rate during the year, so.
So the money's there, it's been
Well,
budgeted.
well,
we
no,
just have to show it again.
it's just this report, when you're looking at it, looks like we're,
We're spending
so
lots more.
maybe there's another column that says, already in the budget, this is the fund balance that was already there.
Yeah, it says that this will come from the beginning fund balance right here. It's
I mean,
notated here.
yeah,
And then on this one as well. And those, and if you were to look at the fund balance, which we haven't finished the financial statements, you would see that both of these amounts, which would be about $10.5 million, that's gonna be your beginning fund balance in your capital improvements fund, and we're just gonna use that money on the projects that were already there carried forward.
And I think to Scott's point, I wouldn't mind an extra column if for those line items
Okay.
that are coming from the previous year's allocated budget that didn't get spent. Anyway, that
I
would.
mean, that's a
that would-
50% budget increase is what it comes.
What it looks
across
like. No,
as,
I get
and-
that. I agree. I think. they would
And I'm
be-
supposed to actually understand this stuff better than most people,
You know,
just because I've been doing this for so long, I'm just like,
yeah.
um,
Is that okay?
Yep, we can definitely do that. So,
I think your other
Okay.
title was instead of, it should be 20,
yeah,
22, not 22, 20, whatever.
yeah, I gotta look at that up still. I've got the details here, so I'll take a look. at
So
that.
we will have a public hearing on this in our business meeting too. So
That's
thank you.
not for adoption until next.
Correct. We'll have another meeting before we adopt. Thank you, Scott. Are you through, Scott? Is that?
Yes.
Okay, awesome. Thank you. Okay, the next item is a review of calendars and upcoming events. One thing I want to make clear and emphasize again is that today will be the last time that we do our business meeting at 6:30. So all business meetings from now on will go to the 7 PM. So we'll still start our work sessions at 4, but we are going to move our business meetings back half an hour to try to give us a little bit more time in our work
Until the
session.
end of the year when we have to set our next year. budget.
Correct. Good point. So a Monster Mash will be held October 28th from 5 to 7 at the Cottonwood Heights Community Recreation Center. Trunk or treat will be held here at City Hall on October 31st, starting at 3 PM. I plan on being here to hand out candy.
Right.
So hopefully, you might want to get some good candy for your district so people know where it's coming from. Light the Heights will be held on November 28th from 6 PM to 9 at City Hall.
Have a pretty good program set up for that, it looks like.
Yeah, that went to that last year. It was great. Future city council meetings in 2022, October 18th, November 1st, sorry, that's today. November 1st and 15th, December 6th and 20th, and then anyway, here at City Hall starting at 4 unless otherwise noticed. Future planning commission meetings November 2nd, and that's all and tomorrow, October 19th and November 2nd. Okay, so we do have an item to discuss in a closed meeting today to discuss property
Is
acquisition.
that, is that this meeting or
I
the
think that's the next.
CDR?
No, we haven't.
This
This
meeting.
Oh,
So-
okay.
I, and also, professional competence.
Yeah.
So, could I get a motion to enter into a closed session?
I'm not a professional, but whatever. I'll move that we close the open session, and open a closed session for the discussion of real estate transactions and personnel matters.
Yes,
And I second that.
yeah, all in favor, say aye.
Aye.
Any
Aye.
opposed? Great.
Grab
Let's go grab food and we're gonna